Welcome to the debate. Today we are really getting into the principles of minimalist winter survival. We're analyzing the decision-making in some recent material that detailed a night spent in the pretty brutal landscape of interior Alaska. And this was during a snowstorm.
Right. And critically, without the gear you'd expect. No tent, no sleeping bag.
Exactly.
So the challenge was immense. Build a safe, warm micro-shelter in just 2 hours that could hold its warmth through 17 hours of Alaskan darkness. And you're relying, entirely on what you can find right there. Every single choice matters.
And the outcome, of course, was a success. He described the night as toasty warm. But this wasn't just one thing. It really relied on a masterful management of, heat transfer physics, conduction, radiation, all of it all at once. So our central question for debate is this: what single strategic component was the most critical to achieving that warmth and safety? I'm going to argue that the deliberate, active heating of the ground, treating the Earth like a massive thermal battery, was the foundational element of success.
And I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. While that initial input of heat was undeniably helpful, I contend that the successful outcome truly depended on the passive system of thermal retention, specifically the strategic use of the caribou hide and that whole padding system. That's what provided the actual, operational margin of safety and warmth for a truly regenerative night's sleep.
My position really rests on prioritizing the single greatest threat in cold weather, and that's conduction. It's the loss of heat directly from your body to a colder surface. And it is the most aggressive heat-sapping mechanism there is, especially when you're sleeping right on the ground. So the primary innovation here wasn't simply insulating against the cold ground, it was eliminating the cold ground as a factor entirely. The security was engineered from the bottom up. The host gave us the key insight himself when he said he'd rather sleep on warm ground without a sleeping bag than sleep on cold ground with a sleeping bag. That right there, that illustrates the whole conceptual leap. Neutralizing conduction with active heat, and the process involved very strategic site selection, choosing a spot near a tipped birch root ball that was resting on clay and rocks. This is crucial because clay and rock, they have high thermal mass. They store heat much more effectively than, say, wet organic soil. And then there was the intentional heat input, burning a fire for about an hour and a half against that massive root ball. That ensured, in his words, the dirt in this giant root ball and all the dirt underneath the fire is storing massive amounts of heat energy. And that stored energy, that's what provides the base warmth that no purely passive system could replicate on its own.
That's a very compelling argument, but if you focus on the physics of heat retention, I think the critical factor changes. So while preheating the ground is clever, the successful outcome depended more heavily on the passive measures that slowed down the loss of that heat over the 17 hours the system had to work. We have to remember the conditions here. The night only dropped to a relatively mild 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about minus 6.6 Celsius.
Right, it wasn't a deep cold snap.
Exactly. And that mildness, it just reduced the need for extreme ground heating. That shifts the emphasis, in my view, to the superior performance of the insulation layer. The critical piece was the caribou hide, combined with that cranberry bush padding. Let's talk about insulation quality for a second. The host rightly identified the caribou hide as probably the best animal hide you can sleep on. The hair on a caribou is hollow, which creates an incredible amount of trapped air. It gives it an extremely high R value, its resistance to thermal flow. This combination of the twigs creating an air gap and the hide itself created a system that addressed conductive loss right under the occupant, which is what ensured comfort in deep sleep. Plus, that root ball served not just as a heat sink, but also as a really efficient structural wall that reflected the fire's radiant heat back. That's a passive mechanism, separate from the ground battery, that made the whole system work. Core debate.
I will absolutely concede that the R value of a caribou hide is phenomenal, but where I diverge is whether even phenomenal insulation can truly overcome a freezing foundation. The inherent vulnerability here is conductive loss to the ground. So we have to ask, are we designing a solution to mitigate an existential threat, or to eliminate it. The ground battery strategy eliminates it. By raising the ground temperature, you get rid of the heat differential. That means there's almost zero net heat loss through that bottom layer. The hide then can do its job perfectly, trapping the body's own convective heat. But if you place even the best insulation on frozen earth, over 17 hours, the ground is just an infinitely large cold sink. It will eventually pull the heat away. The real ingenuity here was recognizing that this is a battle you can't win with purely passive measures. You have to change the state of your opponent, so to speak.
That is a very strong articulation of the active approach. But I have to question the sustainability of relying solely on the heat sink. Insulating the body from the ground is always the priority, because insulation is constant, it's predictable. Ground heat is transient. He only burned the fire for about 90 minutes. To turn that massive area of clay and rock into a genuinely warm, stable heat source for 17 hours, that would require a huge, sustained energy input, which he deliberately skipped because the night was mild. So this suggests the thermal mass, while warm at first, would soon start to cool. That makes the insulation absolutely critical to bridge the gap as the ground temperature dropped. The cranberry bush padding, which created that air gap, and the hide, these were active, strategic decisions made not just to prevent heat loss, but also, as he said, to solve the problem of the bed being hard on the back. That implies a crucial need for comfort, which you need for genuine survival rest. If the warm ground was really the complete solution, he wouldn't have needed them for thermal reasons.
I see the point about the mildness reducing the burn time, but that still proves the foundational importance of the site selection itself. It isn't just about the heat sink, it's about the prevention of a disastrous heat loss scenario. If the host had picked an organic, swampy site, even a mild night would have turned the area under the fire into a saturated heat sponge. I mean, think about the physics of water. Wet ground just absorbs huge amounts of energy from the fire, and then it aggressively wicks heat from your body afterwards. The decision to choose clay and rock ensured the fire's heat wasn't just wasted boiling water, but was stored efficiently in dense, dry material. The hide is useless if it's resting on damp ground you created with a poor site choice. The entire experiment hinges on that non-negotiable first step.
Okay, I agree that site selection prevents catastrophe, but let's look at the materials that provided the actual energy for the system. We can't overlook the strategic selection of materials for the structure and, crucially, for the fuel. He chose birch specifically because it burns hotter and longer than other woods you'd find. So my argument is that focusing on highly efficient materials, the hot birch fire, the spruce structure, the high R value hide, that's a more reliable survival strategy than relying on the thermal properties of the surrounding dirt, which is, inherently variable depending on where you are. The high efficiency of the materials just means you need less energy overall.
That's an interesting line of reasoning, but I'd frame it a little differently. Fuel efficiency, the birch, is a means to an end. The site selection is the foundation that enables the entire system to even function. If you are heating a foundation that is fundamentally flawed, say a patch of frozen moss, no amount of efficient birch fuel will overcome the massive, localized heat loss you'd get from melting the ground right under you. The selection of the thermal mass site was the initial filter that allowed any of the other choices, the birch, the hide, to be effective at all. If the ground had been unsuitable, the entire shelter would have just collapsed into a cold, wet pit. So that choice, the clay and rock site, it's a decision about feasibility that comes before anything else, making it fundamentally the most critical strategic choice.
Okay.
And let's get back to the empirical data. We have direct readings that the shelter temperature stabilized at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 10 Celsius, when the outside was 25 Fahrenheit. That 25-degree temperature differential, that is objective proof the system worked. It turned a minimal shelter into a genuinely toasty warm environment.
But you raised the point earlier that the peak reading, the 55 degrees, was from radiant heat after he just stoked the fire.
I did, and I concede that the spike is radiant, yes. However, the stabilization at 50 degrees, that's the key.
that long-term stabilization, which persisted for hours of inactivity. That demonstrates the thermal mass had absorbed enough latent heat to radiate it back consistently. The rate of temperature decay was extremely slow because the ground was holding and releasing that energy slowly, like a giant low-power radiator. That consistency is the thermal security provided by the active ground heating.
That slow rate of decay is compelling, I'll give you that, but it also highlights the system's limitations and the necessity of the passive measures to compensate. If the thermal mass strategy was fully successful and the ground was radiating a uniform 50 degrees, why did he need supplemental heat? He mentioned using adhesive body warmers on his lower back, noting that the side not facing the fire was, quote, always a little bit cold.
A fair point.
So this shows that even within this supposedly 50-degree shelter, there were cold spots. There were drafts where conduction or convection still threatened his comfort. The body warmer, which is a piece of small, passive, supplemental heat tech, was required to bridge the gap where the massive active ground system was either insufficient or inconsistent. The body warmer and the thick hide are evidence that the passive components were the necessary safety nets that addressed the failure points of the grand thermal mass experiment.
That's a good observation.
And it leads us right to a distinction between just survival, staying above freezing, and successful restorative survival. The host specifically sought out the padding because he was getting too old for this, and the bed was hard on the back. True survival requires a rest. Without restorative sleep, your cognitive function declines. Your ability to make good decisions just plummets. So if the active heat system was fully sufficient for maintaining his core temperature, the inclusion of that bulky, heavy caribou hide would have been pure luxury. Its inclusion, however, suggests that passive insulation was necessary to bridge the gap between warm enough to endure and warm enough to get a good night's sleep. And that distinction is crucial. It makes the passive system the true critical factor.
Comfort is certainly vital, and I agree, achieving deep restorative sleep is the goal of any successful shelter. However, I think we have to distinguish between the system that makes the outcome possible and the system that makes it pleasant. The fundamental concept of using the ground as a giant heat dump is what moved the environment from a high-risk scenario to a low-risk one. It eliminated the primary threat. The caribou hide with its exceptional R value then serves as a highly efficient supplement to an already solved problem. It maximizes the benefit of that pre-warmed ground, providing zero conductive loss and maximizing comfort. It takes the thermal foundation and optimizes it into, well, a bedroom. But without the warm foundation, the hide is fighting a losing battle. With the warm foundation, the hide turns the night into a success story. The foundation is critical, the optimization is secondary. So while the value of those passive layers, the reflective wall, the air-trapping padding, and that exceptional caribou hide, is undeniable, I have to reassert that the structural decision to leverage the specific thermal mass of that root ball and the clay rock ground, that was the foundational and most critical choice. It was the proactive measure that addressed the most difficult heat loss mechanism, conduction, by changing the thermal state of the ground itself. And that fundamental success provided the base energy that stabilized the shelter and allowed all the other passive measures to function at their maximum efficiency.
And I'll concede the cleverness and the necessity of the heat-sink strategy, especially your point about the rigorous site selection. However, I maintain that given the specific constraints of this scenario, the mild outside temperature and the limited 1.5-hour heating time, the successful, restful night was ultimately dependent on the passive system, that system driven by the structural reflection of the wall and, above all, the high R value insulation from the caribou hide and padding that was required to maintain stability and comfort over the long haul as the ground naturally cooled. The critical component was the one that ensured the heat that was generated was never lost.
It seems clear that success in this extreme environment really demanded a synergistic application of both active energy strategies, the ground battery, and efficient passive insulation with the material layers.
Indeed, the complexity of the challenge and the material we have here, it offers robust evidence for both approaches. It really illustrates how effective winter survival in these minimalist conditions requires solving that fundamental problem of conduction, while at the same time optimizing the body's ability to retain its own heat. It's a dual necessity, and it demonstrates the sophistication of the total strategy.